Tampa, Florida, formed in 1873 with a population less than 1,000. The rise in manufacturing in the early 1900s attracted thousands of Cuban, Spanish, and Italian immigrants. Don Vicente Martinez Ybor was seeking to relocate his cigar operations from Cuba and purchased a plot of land in northeast Tampa, naming the area Ybor City. Otherwise known as Little Havana, the ever-presence of the cigar industry sprung up all over Tampa, and the area became more known as Cigar City. With its rich brick buildings and wrought iron balconies, Ybor City looks much like the French Quarter in New Orleans, today a popular tourist area. On weekends then, and as now, the street was busy with visitors from all over. Instead of the sound of jazz like in New Orleans, visitors were greeted with the sound of Spanish reggaeton music and the crow of rooster that inhabited the streets. People from all walks of life would come to the area, including businessmen, cigar factory workers, and locals to place a bet at one of the many gambling houses. The big game of the day was bolita, a type of lottery introduced to Florida by a Cuban immigrant in the 1880s.
The way the bolita worked is it was basically a lottery. There were 100 balls and you could place a bet on a particular number. And one of the beauties of the game was you could place a penny bet, you could place a nickel, you could place $1. So you could decide what the stakes would be in the game. And then there would be people that would go out and collect the bets, and then later that day, twice a lot of times on Sunday, there would be a bolita drawing where a ball would be pulled out, the ball would be revealed, and then if you had the number 98, if that was the winner, you would collect on 98. So that's how the game worked. It was very ceremonious when it came to bolita. There were different tactics for literally mixing up the balls, and one of them was called the bolita throw. So you would put all the balls in the bag and then you would literally throw the bag. There's stories of basically large games where different people would shake up the bag, and then ultimately, you'd have a winner that would cut the ball literally out of the bag. So there were different ways that bolita was played, but it was very ceremonial, and that was part of the attraction of the game, like the Florida Lottery today, where you watch the balls bounce around and it's a big song and dance. That's how bolita was drawn back in the day. One historian said if you looked at less affluent neighborhoods, in particular African-American neighborhoods, you would see bread sales go down during this time, because what a lot of people in those neighborhoods would do is they say, well, maybe I'll skip bread for today and I'll put a penny on the bolita game. And that's one of the interesting things. So you saw people with less means playing right alongside people that had a lot of money and a lot of connections in Tampa. And so we think about bolita as being really tied to Spaniards and Cubans in Tampa, but that's really not the case. It really reaches out into the black community, into the affluent white community, into these other communities. So it's something that's incredibly democratic and really spread about the town. There were different ways that you could fix the game. You could freeze certain balls, and that way that ball would be drawn. You could weight down certain balls so they would sink to the bottom of the bolita bag, so they were more likely to be drawn. So what you see is when you have organized crime officials and then other people in the community that get involved in this, and when the profits become so huge, we see different ways to try to fix the game and try to determine which ball is going to be drawn.
By 1927, over 300 bolita houses were in operation in Ybor City alone. Liquor, gambling, and other nefarious activities became big business for the less than reputable operators. Crime overtook the area as drug trafficking and prostitution ran rabid, and the payrolls of local tobacco factories were prime targets for robbery.
This is the El Reloj cigar factory. When it was built in 1910, it was considered to be the largest and the finest cigar factory in the world. And it had space for more than 1,000 cigar workers who could roll more than 250,000 cigars a week here in this building. And at that time, in the early 1900s, employees were paid by cash. There were no bank accounts for employees, there was no direct deposits, employees didn't receive checks. They received an envelope with cash at the end of every work week. And so in a factory like this one with 1,000 employees, there was a lot of money moving in and out of this building every week on a regular basis. And the same is true for all of the 150 cigar factories that were here in the cigar city of Tampa. And because of that, cigar factories were a very attractive target for the local mafia here in Tampa. And my grandfather told me that it was almost like a circuit, that the mafia would go from one factory to the next, robbing payroll because there was so much cash on hand. And he knew when our turn was next because the factory in front of us in the line got robbed. So once they got robbed, we knew that our time was coming. And so the builders of our El Reloj factory knew this. They thought about this when they built this historic and iconic cigar factory. And what they did is they built this very secret escape staircase for the general manager to quickly leave and escape through the basement of the factory when nefarious people were coming up the front steps. So he could look out and see what was happening outside, and if he didn't like who was coming into the factory, he could pop the hatch and quickly exit through the basement out the back of the factory. And so it was a way to kind of protect himself and have an emergency escape route when the mafia was coming to rob the factory.
In Ybor, gambling took place in high-end palaces as well as grocery store back rooms. Corruption ran heavily in both the political arenas and the police department. Racketeering wasted no time for exploiting the games.
The El Dorado was one of the biggest gambling casinos in Ybor City, and it was partially owned by Charlie Wall and also owned by another underworld figure, Ralph Reyna. And you see a kind of roving door of local underworld guys, both Italian, Sicilian, Cuban, and Spanish that come and go through the El Dorado. It was really well known as a bolita establishment. They threw bolita there a lot. There was all kinds of wide open gambling in the El Dorado. Certainly during Prohibition, they served alcohol there. And this sometimes made it a target of law enforcement, and there's a lot of stories in the newspapers, especially in the 1930s, of raids there at the illegal gambling, taking out all kinds of money the cops would during these raids. So it was definitely one of the more notorious and well-known underworld hangouts and gambling palaces in Ybor City.
Gambling houses lined 7th Avenue, where many swank houses were decorated with lavish decor, live bands, and free-flowing liquor. Then, on January 20th, 1920, with the passing of the 18th Amendment, also known as the Volstead Act, Prohibition caused more lawlessness as speakeasies and bootlegging propelled small-time racketeers to unimaginable levels of power, which led to unwanted competition between the different factions.